A test of love and humility. Steve was a man of quiet resolve and calculated decisions. In his youth, while working tirelessly at a modest position in a corporate company, Steve had good business ideas. He discovered cryptocurrency, a world of opportunities hidden in digital codes. With every paycheck, he invested in assets he felt would yield fortune for him with time. The risks were immense, but Steve's intuition and research turned him into a shrewd investor. After several years of heartbreaks from his previous relationships, Steve got married to a beautiful young lady named Adeline. He loved her so dearly. As time went on, the company Steve was working with downsized, and he found himself among the laid-off workers. Adeline, his wife, was a beacon of hope. She embraced Steve when he came home that fateful day with news of his layoff. "We'll get through this," she said, her voice unwavering. "You're resourceful, and I believe in you." Adeline worked hard, waking up early to head to her job while Steve stayed at home, helping with some house chores, and with his experience in his previous jobs he picked up some freelance jobs online. But Adeline's mother, Mrs. Margaret, was not as kind. She practiced favoritism. She preferred her other two younger daughters who married supposedly rich men over Adeline. She berated her daughter for marrying what she considered a low life. "You could have had wealth, Adeline. Instead, you chose this." She spat with disdain whenever Steve's name came up. Adeline's sisters and friends echoed the sentiment, their scorn weighing heavily on her heart. Mrs. Margaret, a woman known for her sharp tongue and unrelenting pride, never missed an opportunity to humiliate Steve and, by extension, Adeline. Her disdain for Steve's perceived lack of ambition and wealth was palpable in her words and actions. At family gatherings, she would seat Steve and Adeline at the far end of the table, near the kitchen, while the supposedly important guests occupied the prime spots near her. "That's for the ones who've earned their place," she would say loudly, ensuring everyone heard the slight. When Steve offered to help with tasks like arranging chairs or serving drinks, Mrs. Margaret would sneer, "Well, at least you're good for something, Steve. Maybe you should consider this as your next career, a waiter or a cleaner. It suits you." Laughter would ripple through the room, mostly from her friends and Adeline's sisters, who seemed to revel in his humiliation. Adeline always defended Steve, but Mrs. Margaret dismissed her protests. "You're blinded by love, Adeline. One day, you'll wake up and regret tying yourself to a low life." One certain day Adeline and Steve had visited Mrs. Margaret's residence. While Steve was sitting at the dining table eating, Mrs. Margaret walked up to him and said, "What are you doing here, you lowlife? Have I not warned you to stop coming here? This space is for my other daughters and wealthy in-laws." She quickly ordered the food be taken away from him. Adeline loved Steve. She stood by him, defending him against her mother's tirades and her friends' mockery. Steve, on his part, endured the humiliation silently. However, as time went on, Steve's investments in crypto trading started yielding some fortune for him, and unbeknownst to Adeline, his investments had enabled him to build a hidden empire through crypto and other multi-million-dollar investments. He could have easily revealed his wealth, silencing them all, but he was patient and wanted to test the depth of Adeline's love. Mrs. Margaret's 60th birthday was a grand affair. It was the pinnacle of her efforts to belittle Steve. She had invited prominent figures, business moguls, politicians, and wealthy friends. Adeline and Steve arrived with a modest gift in hand, a carefully chosen bouquet of Mrs. Margaret's favorite lilies. As they entered, Mrs. Margaret spotted them and hissed dramatically, "Oh, you two came. I was wondering if you could afford the cab fare," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. A few guests chuckled, while Adeline's sisters smirked. Steve remained calm, but Adeline bristled. "Mother, that's enough," she said. "Enough. I'm just stating facts, dear," Mrs. Margaret replied, brushing past them. Steve and Adeline were relegated to a corner as the poor relatives. Guests barely acknowledged them, and the air was thick with condescension. During the party, Mrs. Margaret made a show of introducing her wealthier guests. "This is Mr. Thompson, owner of 3 luxury hotels," she would say loudly. When it came to Steve, she pointedly ignored him. As the evening progressed, Mrs. Margaret orchestrated a cruel game. She called for each son-in-law to share their achievements. "Let's see what everyone has been up to," she announced. One by one, the other men spoke of promotions, business ventures, and accomplishments. When it was Steve's turn, Mrs. Margaret interrupted before he could speak. "Oh, we all know Steve's achievements. He's mastered the art of staying at home. Isn't that right, Steve?" Laughter erupted, and Steve's face reddened. Adeline clenched her fists, but Steve gently squeezed her hand, silently asking her to let it go. As the celebrations reached their peak, a brand new luxury car was delivered to Mrs. Margaret. The delivery team announced, "This is a birthday gift from your son-in-law, Steve, and your daughter, Adeline." The room fell silent. Whispers spread like wildfire. Mrs. Margaret was stunned. "How?" she stammered, her gaze fixed on Steve. Adeline, equally shocked, asked Steve how he managed such an expensive gift. Steve simply replied, "I saved a little from my jobs. I wanted to honor your mother." The crowd gasped. Mrs. Margaret stared at the luxury car, a brand new SUV with all the bells and whistles, her expression a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "How could he afford this?" she muttered under her breath. Adeline's sisters, who had been mocking Steve all night, exchanged nervous glances. One finally asked, "Steve, where did you get the money for this? Did you win the lottery?" Mrs. Margaret, still skeptical, said coldly, "Well, I hope you didn't sell anything illegal or borrow money to make a fool of yourself here." Steve simply smiled. "It's a small token of appreciation for the mother of the woman I love." But Mrs. Margaret couldn't let it go. Throughout the night, she whispered to her friends, speculating about Steve's sudden generosity. Her words poisoned the air, casting doubt and suspicion. When Steve and Adeline returned home, Adeline broke down. "How much more of this can we take, Steve? My love for you has never wavered, but my mother's cruelty is unbearable." Steve hugged her tightly. "Patience, my love. The truth will come out in time. They'll see who we are, and they'll regret every word they've spoken." Little did Mrs. Margaret know that her humiliation of Steve would soon become her greatest regret. The car gift raised questions. Adeline's mother and sisters speculated about Steve's source of wealth, some accusing him of fraud or even ritual practices. Adeline, however, was torn between love and suspicion. One day, unable to contain her curiosity, she trailed Steve. She followed him to a sprawling office complex. As he stepped inside, staff members greeted him with reverence, bowing and addressing him as "Sir." Adeline was baffled. Gathering her courage, she approached a staff member and inquired about Steve. "Steve? Oh, you mean Mr. Stephen Andrews. He's the CEO of this company and several others. He's one of the most successful businessmen in the city," the staff member said, oblivious to Adeline's shock. Adeline returned home, her emotions in turmoil. She packed her belongings and left Steve a note. "Steve, I don't know how long you intended to hide your true identity from me. I had to find out the hard way. I thought we shared everything, but you kept this from me. I need time to process this. Goodbye." She returned to her mother's house and revealed the truth. Mrs. Margaret and Adeline's sisters were floored. Guilt consumed them as they realized they had mistreated a man of immense wealth and humility. When Steve came home and read the note, he was heartbroken but relieved. Adeline's unwavering love during his poor days had proven her sincerity. He drove to Mrs. Margaret's house in a flashy Jeep, determined to make amends. "I didn't mean to deceive you, Adeline," Steve said, his voice trembling. "I've been hurt before by people who only loved my wealth. When I met you, I needed to be sure. And you showed me love that wasn't tied to money. I'm sorry for hiding the truth." Adeline listened, tears streaming down her face. She saw the sincerity in Steve's eyes and forgave him. Together, they moved into a magnificent mansion, a home befitting Steve's true status. Adeline discovered not only the depth of Steve's wealth but also the breadth of his humility. Her mother and sisters, now humbled, apologized profusely to Steve. In the end, love and humility triumphed. Adeline and Steve's bond grew stronger, their story a testament to the power of love that transcends wealth. Mrs. Margaret and her daughters learned the value of respect and the dangers of judgment. And Steve, the man who tested love with silence, found in Adeline the greatest wealth of all, a partner who loved him for who he was, not for what he had.